Fosbury and Titanic's lifebelts. Fosbury & Co. was a limited company founded in the late 19th century to design and manufacture life-saving equipment such as lifebuoys, life rings, and lifebelts. In early 1911, the White Star Line appointed Fosbury & Co. to supply and equip their brand new liners Olympic and Titanic with the latest in life-saving equipment, including newly approved Fosbury overhead pattern lifebelts. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg on her maiden voyage and began to sink. Passengers were ordered to put their lifebelts on and to go onto the boat deck. When the Titanic finally sank at 2:20 a.m. on the 15th, about 650 passengers had boarded the lifeboats and about 60 were able to survive using collapsible boats A and B. 4 were pulled from the water. 712 survivors were eventually picked up by the Cunard liner Carpathia. As dawn broke, it became apparent that some 1,500 souls had lost their lives to the frigid North Atlantic Ocean, many wearing the now famed Fosbury overhead lifebelts they had hoped would save their lives. Upon boarding the Carpathia, many survivors placed their lifebelts into piles on the deck and in cargo holds of the ship. For unknown reasons, Arthur Rostron, captain of the Carpathia, ordered these lifebelts to be cut up and discarded. But some were saved as mementos by the survivors who wore them or kept as a trophy by quick-fingered souvenir hunters. Most have sadly now been lost to time, but through the tireless work and dedication of several world-renowned historians, experts, and researchers, 14 examples have now been found, fully authenticated and catalogued within this video and related website, titaniclifebelts.net. The video is intended to be the most complete and definitive resource regarding the topic of Titanic's lifebelts and the company that made them. I hope you find it informative and educational. This video was put together by Jerry Vondeling, with special thanks to Titanic researcher, collector, and author Steve Santini, Paul Burns, curator of the Pigeon Forge Branson Titanic Museum attractions, Ken Marshall, Gunter Babler, Craig Sopan, Alexander Corthus, and others who would prefer to stay anonymous for their invaluable assistance with this video and related website. All efforts have been made to credit and ask permission of all image sources. There has been no intention to illegally use other people's images. Fosbury & Co., London. The Fosbury Life Preserver Factory was owned and founded by Arthur Fosbury. He was born in 1836 in Upper Clapton, Middlesex, as the son of Caroline and John. Arthur was married to Anne Carl and had 4 children. In the 1881 census, he is listed as a manufacturer of marine life-saving apparatus and the employer of 3 men and 1 woman. Arthur Fosbury died in the first quarter of 1915. His founding partner was most probably Thomas Giel. He lived from circa 1842 until 1889. His identity is unconfirmed, but since Giel is such a rare name, other candidates can almost certainly be ruled out, and his early death would explain the name change of the company. The first cork lifebelt was invented in 1854 by Royal National Lifeboat Institution Inspector Captain Ward. So the Fosbury and Giel Company must have been founded sometime in the early 60s of the 19th century. Lifebelt requirements. In the early 20th century, the manufacture of lifebelts in Great Britain was strictly controlled by a section of the government known as the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade decided on and set the strict rules that all lifebelts being manufactured must abide by and adhere to. Some of these rules and regulations can be seen set out below, found in the 1908 Board of Trade Circular No. 14. All lifebelts within the exception mentioned in paragraph 2, which are inspected for the first time after the 1st December 1908, must comply at least with the following requirements in a matter of length: covers, tape, sewing, cork, and marking. Length. The belts where fully stretched out are to be at least 50 inches long from the outside of the cork to outside of cork, but when laid flat with the corks pushed close together, their length is not to exceed the unreadable couple of inches. As can be seen in the image, the scan of the Board of Trade circular has folds in the pages. As a result of this, measurements and some words could not be read entirely and have been interpreted. With thanks to Robert Reed for the copy. Covers. The covers are to be of all linen Tecklenburg with no mixture of another material, weighing no less than 6 ounces. To the yard with a width of 27 inches. It must have at least 28 threads to the inch in the warp and in the weft, and is to be unglazed and unmangled and free from all dressing. It may be bleached or unbleached, but no artificial colored material is to be used. Tapes. The tapes are to be of linen thread web 1¼ inches wide and capable of bearing a strain of 200 pounds. The ends of the tapes where they are attached to the covers are to be double and the ends are to be displayed. The free length of each tying is to be 38 inches. The shoulder connection to consist of a loop of a free length of 3 inches on one side and a strap 30 inches long on the other sewing. The tops of the layers are to be sewn with material which is to be double and of not less strength than number 25 of 5-cord Whittemore cord. All other sewing is to be made with linen thread not less than number 50. Cork. There shall be not more than 10 pockets in a belt, and if more than one piece of cork is used in any pocket, the following rules shall be complied with, viz. A. If the cork is put in lengthwise, not more than 2 pieces may be used in each pocket, and each piece must be the full length of the pocket, and not less than half the width. B. If the cork is put in breadthwise, not more than 3 pieces may be used in each pocket, and each piece must be of the full breadth of the pocket, and not less than 1/4 of the length. C. If 2 or more pieces of cork are pegged or glued together, each piece used in making up the block is to count as a separate piece. Marking. Each belt is to be marked warranted to pass Board of Trade survey. 2. Nothing in the foregoing is to prevent a higher standard being followed in any of the particulars mentioned, and the specification does not apply in the case of belts of special construction for which a certificate of approval as in Surveys 115 has been granted by the Board of Trade. 3. Belts originally passed before the 1st April 1908 need not be rejected because they do not comply in all respects with the above specification, provided that the buoyancy is satisfactory and the belts are strong and fit for the purpose for which they are intended for. Any belt which has not the required buoyancy or which in the surveyor's opinion is not fit for the purpose for which it is intended should be rejected. 5. This circular embodies circulars 1429 and 1440 which are now cancelled. In 1912, the Titanic was equipped with 3,560 of the newly designed Fosbury overhead lifebelts manufactured by the London firm Fosbury & Co. Some surviving examples of these lifebelts exhibit a distinctive diamond-shaped approval stamp from the Board of Trade which reads, "Warranted to pass Board of Trade survey." This indicates that this new design of lifebelt adhered to the requirements at the time from the Board of Trade. Markings on the lifebelts. On some of the surviving lifebelts, markings in the form of stamps can be seen. As could be read in the lifebelt requirements, each one had to be stamped ensuring it was warranted to pass Board of Trade survey. Other additional markings have been observed on a selection of lifebelts as well. Some examples have been stamped to identify the front, the inside back, and a Fosbury maker's mark can be seen on the front bottom cork pockets. It would appear that not all lifebelts were stamped, but as can be seen with the Oster lifebelt, these stampings tend to fade over time and become invisible to the naked eye. The markings were added using a hand stamp on the flat linen fabric before the cork blocks were inserted, utilizing either a dark blue or purple shade of ink. The exact color and size of the imprints vary between lifebelts, which shows that more than one stamp was used on the production line. Although subtle variations have been noted in the stamps themselves, they are all in the same style and all appear on the same cork pockets from example to example, suggesting there was a guideline to follow when marking the lifebelts. Archival photos and newsreel footage of Carpathia stewards in white coats posing in Titanic lifebelts show that the flax linen used by Fosbury was nearly a pure white when new, so the purple or indigo stamps must have once stood out prominently. Titanic's remaining lifebelts. In the many years since the Titanic disaster, it had been claimed that only a handful of the 3,560 lifebelts supplied to the ship had survived. It is often said that only 6 remain, but detailed and extensive research has shown that this is incorrect. Even during study for the website, TitanicLifebelts.net, 3 more examples came to light. This raised the number of remaining, fully authenticated lifebelts to 14, and who knows, there may be even more hidden away in private collections or stored in attics. We will now take a look at the remaining lifebelts from the Titanic. Lifebelt worn by Madeline Oster. It is said that during the disaster, Mr. Oster cut open a lifebelt to show his wife what was inside to assure her that they were safe and would keep a person afloat. He made sure Madeline wore her lifebelt and got into a lifeboat. The next morning when she was rescued, Carpathia crew member Gottlieb Rencher took her to the ship's hospital where she took off her lifebelt and left it. Renshaw resigned from sea duty in December 1912, settled in New York, and became a chiropractor. He kept the lifebelt in his possession and had it in his office for many years. In 1978, Renshaw's son was listening to a WCBS radio interview with the president of the Titanic Historical Society, William Harris Tantum IV. Renshaw Jr. wrote to the society explaining that he wanted to donate the historic artifact to an organization where it would be displayed and appreciated. Ed Commuta, founder of the group, replied that they would be honored to receive this important artifact. Later, as a fundraiser for the society, very small fragments of its cork which had crumbled off were sold as tiny souvenirs. A faded Fosbury maker's mark, as can be seen on the photographs. At first glance, the Oster lifebelt appears to be a clean but worn lifebelt with no Fosbury maker's mark, which some of the other lifebelts have exhibited. After closely examining numerous photographs taken during several Titanic exhibitions, Gunter Babler noticed in one, dated 1992, that the Oster lifebelt did in fact show a very faint Fosbury maker's stamp, possibly due to handling, cleaning and or displaying the lifebelt under unfavorable conditions. The stamp has faded over the years and is now almost completely invisible to the naked eye. This shows that the stamps, done in a purple or dark blue ink, are vulnerable to fading very easily when being exposed to daylight, ultraviolet light or fluorescent light for long periods. Perhaps other lifebelts also had these stamps once, but they do not seem to appear in period photographs or film footage. Lifebelt worn by Laura Mabel Francatelli. Laura Mabel Francatelli accompanied the Duff Gordons on their voyage to New York aboard Titanic. They were all in one of the first lifeboats to leave the ship, carrying a paltry total of only 12 people aboard. Upon embarking the rescue ship Carpathia, Francatelli asked the other survivors in the lifeboat to sign her lifebelt as a souvenir. Some of the signatures have sadly faded, but 8 of them can still be read. As well as the autographs, the Francatelli lifebelt also has some superbly preserved stamp markings. Most other known lifebelts do not show these markings. Research shows, however, that they may have had the same stamps when manufactured, but the imprints have simply faded away, much like in the case of Mrs. Oster's lifebelt. After Francatelli's death in 1967, her lifebelt was bequeathed to her nephew, son of Mabel's younger sister Dorothy Francatelli. Interestingly, Dorothy was one of Lady Duff Gordon's models. In May 2007, Francatelli's lifebelt was sold at Christie's auction house for £60,000, the highest price paid for any Titanic lifebelt to date. It was bought by an anonymous bidder. A couple of days after the rescue in 1912, a photograph of the group was taken. Miss Francatelli, pictured here third from the right in a photograph taken aboard Carpathia, showing some occupants of lifeboat number 1 taken by Carpathia's doctor who had an interest in photography. The photo was taken when the Boat 1 group was reassembled a couple of days after the rescue. The survivors put their lifebelts back on for the occasion. Left to right, standing, George Simmons, Frederick Sheath, Lucy and Cosmo Duff Gordon, Laura Francatelli, Abraham Salomon, Charles Hendrickson. From left to right, seated, Robert Pusey, Edward Horswell, Samuel Collins, James Taylor. The photo is published in the Daily Sketch, London, May 21, 1912, is in the Randy Bryan Bigham collection. Lifebelt worn by James McGrady. On May 16, 1912, the passenger cargo ship Aldrine left St. John's, Newfoundland, to recover more bodies from the Titanic disaster. She was fully loaded with ice and coffins for the grim task ahead. Although she searched the Atlantic for 3 weeks, the crew only recovered the body of 27-year-old saloon steward James McGrady. He was still being buoyed by a lifebelt and was in a poor state of decomposition. McGrady was the last to be found by the recovery ships. Although only 328 bodies in total were brought back to Halifax, his was numbered 330. It is unknown why, but in counting the recovered bodies, numbers 324 and 325 were not used. McGrady was taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where, on June 12, 1912, he was the last of the Titanic victims to be interred at Fairview Lawn Cemetery. His lifebelt was kept and is now on display in the Provincial Museum of Newfoundland and Labrador, known as the Rooms. The McGrady lifebelt is a complete one. Although not visible in these photographs taken by the museum, the lifebelt still has its side straps, and the inside has no damage or discoloration.
Lifebelt saved by Edwin McClellan. Edwin Clay McClellan was one of the many undertakers who were brought to Halifax for the purpose of preparing the hundreds of bodies recovered by the Mackay Bennett and Minya for burial. To prevent further damage to skin, the lifebelts removed from bodies were generally cut at the 4 ties and shoulder straps. Edwin kept one as a memento of this night to remember. The lifebelt was later passed to his grandson, who donated it to the Mariners Museum in Virginia in 1988.
Lifebelt saved by Dr. Frank Blackmar. Chicago physician Dr. Frank Blackmar, a passenger aboard Titanic's rescue ship Carpathia, helped and supported the survivors who were suffering from hypothermia, exposure, and shock. He collected a Titanic lifebelt during the voyage as a souvenir. A newspaper article published in the Kane Republican of July 29, 1912, documents that Dr. Blackmar and his wife extended their European trip. After landing in New York, they visited Oil City, Pennsylvania, for a visit to his mother-in-law. Following further research, it was learned that the Orpheum Theatre announced on the 27th of July that they showed 3 good comedies and also the rescue ship Carpathia, a great vidograph picture of the ship that came to the rescue of the Titanic passengers. Since it had been some months since the disaster, such a presentation seemed quite delayed. Interestingly, the original advertisement for that day did not have any Carpathia reference, but simply the titles of the 3 comedies. It seems that the note mentioning Carpathia was added last minute into the program. Theater managers were traditionally opportunists, and the change would make sense if Blackmar was taken on stage that night. If Blackmar was made an appearance that evening, as research suggests, it might have been the first public display of this lifebelt. In later years, his descendants donated it to the Chicago Historical Society, who later donated it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1982. Photographs on the website of the Smithsonian show the front and inside back. The latter image gives us a nice view of the markings that were inside some lifebelts. Also on the inside, there is a later added inscription mentioning it to be from the Chicago Historical Society. The Smithsonian's photographs of the inside back of the lifebelt also gives a nice view of the inner markings, now rather faded. A photograph of the front of the lifebelt made by Gunter Babler in June 2024 shows an inscription that Dr. Blackmar wrote on the lifebelt. It reads, "Property of Dr. F. H. Blackmar, from Titanic."
Lifebelt saved by Ernest St. Clair. Ernest St. Clair was a 19-year-old waiter aboard Carpathia when it received Titanic's call for assistance. When the Titanic's lifeboats were taken aboard, many of them were ransacked by souvenir hunters. Young Mr. St. Clair saw an opportunity and saved a lifebelt and 2 toll pins from lifeboat number 9 for himself. In 1962, he donated the items to the Merseyside Maritime Museum.
Lifebelt saved by Josip Carr. When Carpathia came to Titanic's assistance, 76 Croatian crew members were part of the ship's complement. Among them was Josip Carr, who assisted Titanic survivors in getting out of the boats and on board. He took good care of them by keeping them warm in blankets and ensuring that they were as comfortable as possible. Once aboard the Carpathia, with the rare exception, Titanic survivors discarded their lifebelts, which lay abandoned on deck. Carr took one to keep as a memento and brought it back to Croatia with him. In 1938, he donated his lifebelt to the Rijeka Museum, where it was kept in storage and eventually forgotten. 2 decades ago, in the year 2000, Slobodan Novakovic and his Swiss colleague Gunter Babler extensively studied Titanic's history and located Rijeka's lost lifebelt. It was sadly found in a very poor condition. It has since been fully cleaned and extensively repaired and put on display in the museum. It is the only known Titanic lifebelt to be in Eastern Europe. The photos were taken by Slobodan Novakovic and are in the Gunter Babler collection. Lifebelt saved by William F. Johnson. For the grim task of recovering the bodies of Titanic's victims, many undertakers from Halifax and the surrounding towns and cities were asked to assist. William Johnson, an employee for Farquhar Brothers, based in Halifax, volunteered to help the Mackay Bennett's crew. Farquhar Brothers supplied electric equipment to vessels, including the cable ships which were harbored in Halifax. Mr. Johnson told his grandson that the reason he volunteered at the time was because some of the Mackay Bennett's crew were not keen on going, as the body recovery was to be grim. And since the men from Farquhar frequently serviced these ships, they were familiar with the vessels and would be able to help operate them efficiently. Furthermore, Mr. Johnson stated that when they retrieved the bodies, the knots binding the straps of the lifebelts were not only waterlogged tight but also frozen solid. So in most cases, the lifebelts had to be cut from the corpses and thrown onto a stack on the deck of the ship. It was from this pile that Mr. Johnson took this lifebelt as a memento. It found its way into the hands of collector Steve Santini, who passed it on to Titanic collector Stanley Lara. For a while it was on display at the Pigeon Forge Branson Titanic Museum attraction. Since November 2022, it has been on loan to Titanic the exhibition in New York City until early September 2023 with an option to prolong. According to the Washingtonian, the lifebelt moved with the exhibition to Maryland's National Harbor. The exhibition opened there on October 21, 2023 and was on display until December 10, 2023. Stains. Sometimes the stains on this lifebelt are described as oil or rust stains, but it is also likely they could be blood stains, as some of Titanic's victims were found with broken jaws and necks. The reason for this is that when a passenger jumped from the sinking ship into the water, the buoyancy of the cork-filled lifebelts made them float immediately, while the wearer slipped down into the lifebelt due to there being no strap between the legs, causing the chin to be hit by the hard cork underneath being quickly thrust upward and the head to be knocked backward, hence breaking the wearer's jaw or even their neck. This design of lifebelt eventually became known as jawbreakers and was discontinued shortly afterward. On the inside of the lifebelt there was an inscription indicating that this lifebelt came from Titanic. This inscription became known when the lifebelt was displayed inside out during Titanic the exhibition in New York City. The inscription is slightly drawn over to enhance the writing. Photos shown here are made by Paul Burns of the Pigeon Forge Branson Titanic Museum attractions and Neil Adrian Smith. Lifebelt saved by John James Dunbar. This lifebelt was collected by John James Dunbar when he went to Halifax to help with the cleanup after the sinking of Titanic. On his return, he brought the lifebelt back to North Lake, Nova Scotia. It is unclear whether it came from a beach sweep along the shores of Nova Scotia, looking for remains of the disaster, or from a victim who had been recovered by the Mackay Bennett, the Minya, or one of the other ships sent out on the search for bodies. It is also possible that it originated from debris picked up by one of the vessels. It is well documented that all of the ships brought back pieces of floating debris, such as fragments of wood and deck chairs. Since the ocean's current swept bodies and wreckage away from Nova Scotia, it is unlikely to have come from its shores. As a matter of fact, the crew of the Mackay Bennett had expressed their concern that once the bodies were carried too far south, they would no longer be preserved by the cold water and therefore quickly decompose. Mr. Dunbar apparently helped whenever help was needed. He reportedly also did the same after the Great Halifax explosion of 1917. The lifebelt eventually came into the possession of his grandson, Winston Dunbar Macquarie, who had never known his maternal grandfather. And after a while, nobody thought much of the cork-filled canvas life preserver. We actually played with it because we didn't know anything about it, Macquarie once said in an interview in Windsor where he lived. It was a toy. My sister Joyce jumped off the haymow in it so she wouldn't get hurt. It was seemingly never looked after, and Macquarie remembered putting it in a trunk at age 18. Never to be thought of again until June 2008 when it was brought up for auction at Christie's. It sold for $68,500 to an anonymous bidder.
Lifebelt saved by Robert Edwards. Robert Edwards was a quartermaster aboard the Mackay Bennett on its voyage to retrieve victims of the Titanic. Mr. Edwards' daughter Anita inherited the lifebelt and donated it to the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in 1969. It was later, in 1972, traded for a collection of military hats that were collected by Mr. Mark James and on display in the museum. Mr. James's mother immigrated with her family to Canada on Olympic in 1921. Mrs. James recollected that Olympic had a narrow brush with an iceberg on that voyage. Mark heard this and became interested in Titanic. As he grew up, he found himself consulting the 1912 newspapers which recounted the disaster, and his interest grew. In the spring of 1972, a display of military hats was mounted at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum through the Military Collectors Club of Canada. Mark James was a member of the club, and he participated in the display when the exhibition ended in June 1972. Mr. James went to the museum to collect his military headgear. He and a Mr. Gosley, curator of the museum, began to discuss a possible trade. Mr. Gosley took him to the basement and opened a closet-like door which revealed a long storage space. And in it was one lifebelt and a deck chair, both of which Mr. Gosley indicated were from the Titanic. Mr. James stated that his eyes probably revealed his interest. Soon afterward, he took a carload of military items over to Mr. Gosley, and the two of them negotiated the trade. Mark James also recalls Mr. Gosley alluding to a second lifebelt in the museum's collection as being the reason why he could do this trade. All tough, Mr. James did not see the second lifebelt. In 1975, Mr. James lent the lifebelt and other Titanic items from his collection to the Maritime Command Museum for a period of 5 to 6 years. In mid-1994, Mark James decided to sell his entire collection, and it went to a Cape Breton Island padlock collector named Francis Arsenault. It was later purchased by the Wonders exhibit in Memphis, Tennessee and St. Petersburg, Florida. It had also been on display at the Titanic, Ship of Dreams exhibition in Orlando, Florida. The owners of the Memphis exhibition then gave it to British collector Dennis Cochrane as part of an agreement for having a number of Cochrane's Titanic-related objects on display in the exhibition. In September 2006, it was auctioned at Aldridge's and was expected to go for £30,000 to £40,000. It was sold for £43,500 to a private collector. In 2019, it was part of an exhibition at Titanic Branson and then Titanic Pigeon Forge showing 6 lifebelts worn by Titanic passengers. The first time since the sinking that so many lifebelts had been reunited in one place. From April 7th until April 24th, 2022, it was on display at the Titanic Belfast Museum attraction, Northern Ireland, to commemorate the 110th anniversary of the disaster. On March 4th, 2023, the reimagined Titanic experience was opened at Titanic Belfast, and the lifebelt is part of the display, on loan for a period of 5 years. The artifact itself is in fair condition with the usual characteristic signs of age. 2 blocks of cork are missing from their pouches on one side. It still has its original ribbon ties. Lifebelt presumably worn by Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon in September 2001. An anonymous UK-based collector bought some White Star Line items from another collector in Liverpool. Among them were several items from the Arabic, which sank in 1915 during the First World War. In this collection was a Fosbury lifebelt, so it was assumed that the lifebelt also came from the Arabic. Sometime after the initial publication of the lifebelt article in Titanic Post, I was introduced to a woman whose friend had a lifebelt in his collection. After having received some photographs for studying, I shared them with Ken Marshall, who had assisted with the first article. It was he who, in the first low-resolution photos I had received, noticed faint writing on some of the cork blocks. He could not read all of it, but he could see the number 15 in 2 places of the inscriptions. I took another look at the photographs and instantly recognized one of the markings. It reads, "Saved 15 April J. Taylor, fireman, horseman." I had seen this very wording before, so I looked for the photographs of the Francatelli and the Lady Duff Gordon lifebelts, where I saw it again, the same name and the same handwriting. If this was correct, this wasn't an Arabic lifebelt at all, but another one that was in lifeboat number 1 of the Titanic. Taking a closer look at new, higher resolution photographs, I noticed another name, R. Pusey, Robert Pusey, a Titanic crew member. Mr. Marshall had partially recognized another inscription on the top left cork block reading, "Saved 15 April, 1912, Rowboat 1. But under that I noticed a name, none other than Francatelli herself. All survivors of the Titanic disaster. It had to be a Titanic lifebelt. All the inscriptions were written in pencil, which would have stood out more prominently when the linen was new and almost white. Without telling the contact about our findings, I inquired about the backstory of this lifebelt and was told the collector had bought it from a Liverpool military and maritime collector who had purchased it about 25 years prior, about 1976, from a London house clearance. After hearing this, I decided to check the background of all occupants of Boat 1. Did anyone connected live in London during the 1970s? We found 2 possible owners for the lifebelt, which could have resulted in such a house clearance around 1976. Crewman Charles Hendrickson, also in Boat 1, had been living in London after the Titanic disaster. His widow died there in 1979. The second possibility was none other than Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon's stepdaughter Esme, Dowager Countess of Halsbury, who died there in 1973. Could she have had Sir Cosmo's lifebelt in her possession? We needed to find out if Sir Cosmo had saved his lifebelt. Randy Bigham, a leading expert on the Duff Gordon family, was contacted to ask for his input. He found a letter, assumed to be written to Eleanor Glynn, sister of Lady Lucy Duff Gordon, from their attorney Bainbridge Colby. It reads, "We had a period of great anxiety here until their names appeared on the list of survivors. I met the Carpathia on its arrival. It was a most solemn and tense moment when its gangplank was thrown ashore. Sir Cosmo and her ladyship sauntered off in apparently excellent condition of health and courage. Their baggage consisted of 2 lifebelts, which they are preserving as mementos of their terrible experience." Now we knew Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon had indeed saved his lifebelt. Mr. Bigham went on to say, "The possibility that this life jacket belonged to one of the members of Boat 1 crew, I think, is a slim one. I know of no mentions that Titanic crewman Simmons or Hendrickson kept their life jackets, or that they asked the others to sign them. I feel they would not have asked the Duff Gordons to sign them, although I am sure the couple would have done so if asked." Gunter Babler also did some background research into Mr. Hendrickson's widow. and found that the couple had been living apart since the 1930s, so it is unlikely that she had kept Charles Hendrickson's lifebelt. It would therefore be improbable to include Hendrickson's widow as the possible source for this lifebelt. Therefore, we can assume it was worn and belonged to Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, who had probably willed it to his stepdaughter, who kept it until she herself passed away in London in 1973. Interestingly, this lifebelt differs from other ones as the stamp markings appear in dark blue ink instead of purple. Previously, Ken Marshall had also noticed that there was some variation in the letters and word spacing in other Titanic lifebelt stamp markings when compared to one another. This indicates that slightly different stamps were used throughout production, either newer or older. Stamps were no doubt being remade quite often. Lifebelt likely worn by a Titanic crewman in October 2022. One of our contacts mentioned having seen a lifebelt in Plymouth, England, some years ago. Not having heard about a lifebelt in Plymouth, we gladly accepted her offer to contact the owner and bring him in touch with us. He supplied us with new photographs of his lifebelt. After comparing these with the known ones, we could certainly say this was another lifebelt previously unknown to us. Sadly, not much could be told about its history. The current owner has had the lifebelt for about 30 years. He saved it from going to a landfill, having discovered it in a bin in an alleyway behind a charity shop. He took it at the time to the local museum and then the lifeboat station, the operators of which had little interest and couldn't tell him much more about it than was obvious, that it was an old, obsolete cork and canvas lifebelt. Since there was no internet at that time, the current owner couldn't do much more with it and kept it in storage under his bed. About 10 years ago, he had an acrylic stand made for it, upon which it's been displayed in his home since. The lifebelt appeared identical in every aspect to the one saved from Titanic. But we could not be sure it was from the Titanic herself, since Fosbury delivered their lifebelts to both British and foreign governments and not just to the White Star Line or Titanic. To help with further narrowing it down, we did some more research into the Fosbury overhead-style lifebelts. In 1910, the company placed an advertisement in which they promoted their life-saving equipment as being up to date with the 1908 Board of Trade rules. But it made no mention of the overhead lifebelt. We know the design was supplied to Olympic, so they must have been manufactured in or before 1911. Fosbury's overhead type were still mentioned in advertisements from 1914 and mid-1915, but no later. They were seemingly out of production by mid-1915, since it would not be practical to replace a ship's entire complement with new lifebelts every time a new or improved design was offered. We can assume this lifebelt had to have come off a relatively new ship built between 1911 and early 1915, as Plymouth hosts the largest naval base in Western Europe, nearby in Devonport. It might have been assumed that the lifebelt originated from one of the naval vessels. But why would anybody save a lifebelt from a naval ship? It became doubtful that anyone would keep and preserve a plain, unmarked lifebelt from back then unless it meant something to the person. It would likely only mean something and have some sentimental value if the wearer was in a serious incident and wore it for some time and not just during a brief lifeboat drill. After the shock of Lusitania's loss in the spring of 1915, wartime sinkings unfortunately became relatively commonplace. People who survived such calamities usually wanted to put the horrific experience behind them. It was wartime. We could assume that a lifebelt would only be kept and preserved if the owner went through a particularly notable or memorable disaster. After being made aware that he owned a lifebelt that is identical to those worn off Titanic, the owner embarked on a quest to find out more about the artifact's provenance. He tried to go back to the charity shop which had been on Union Street, but it had closed years ago and he could not get any information about the previous owners of the building. Knowing it might be a long shot, he decided to post flyers around town and on social media. Ken Marshall whipped up a colorful ad, sent it to the owner, who went to work. Perhaps a previous owner would recognize the lifebelt or somebody else could tell us more about its history. Now all we could do is wait and hope that someone may come forward with helpful information. To the surprise of all of us, several people contacted him. 3 of them shared an interesting story. A gentleman telephoned him and said this life jacket, or one identical, was kept in a warehouse office where he worked, which was on Bath Place just off of Union Street, the very street where the current owner later found it. This was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Interestingly, the man added that in the same warehouse with the lifebelt was a woolen jumper with White Star Line written on the front, both kept in a large canvas laundry sack. He was in no doubt that other people who worked there would remember this too. Another gentleman contacted him who was involved in redeveloping the same area of Plymouth in the early 1990s. While clearing warehouses in that area, he and his coworkers donated items found to the local charity shop on Union Street. He and a friend of his both remember taking this lifebelt, among other things, down to the very same shop in a wheelbarrow. Research on the lifebelt continued, and we corresponded about having saltwater diatom testing done to see whether it had been exposed directly to seawater. Meanwhile, a third gentleman who had seen the ad came forth and contacted the current owner. He confirmed the warehouse story, but also could tell us that a foot-long metal plate with Titanic lettered on it accompanied the lifebelt and jumper. After showing him a photograph of a Titanic lifeboat nameplate, the gentleman confirmed that it is exactly what he remembered. The nameplate was kept in a toolbox, he said, but since the premises closed in 1972, the whereabouts of this plate is currently unknown. It has seemingly been lost to history. Both Bath Place and Union Street are in the Millbay area of Plymouth, directly next to the docks. Nowadays it's mostly a newly built housing estate, but once it was a busy dock and commercial area with warehouses, a train station of its own and frequent shipping. It's also the very same docks where Titanic's surviving crew were landed from the ship Lapland in 1912, only 13 days after the disaster. Although now abandoned, the old pier is in fact still standing today. The warehouses on Bath Place where this lifebelt originated before going to the charity shop was built around 1840. Curious about stamps on the lifebelt, we asked the current owner if he could make out any remnants of markings that might have faded away. He went outside and looked at his lifebelt in clear daylight more closely than he ever had before. He could see no indications that there had ever been any imprints on it, but he did notice for the first time what looked like some faint pencil inscriptions. He could just make out what appeared to be TSS Titan. There was a smudge where an I and C might be. Ken Marshall urged the owner to have the cork pocket scanned in different directions for better visibility. After doing some blending and enhancements on the scans, the complete inscription could be read for the first time in decades. Now with these markings on one of the cork blocks of a lifebelt once stored in a linen sack with a woolen white starline jumper, accompanied by no less than a Titanic lifeboat nameplate, we have a case of overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Another surviving Titanic lifebelt had been rediscovered. In the meantime, the results of the salinity tests came back and proved that the presumed crew member lifebelt had once been splashed with, or in, ocean water. So whoever wore this was actually in the icy sea at least briefly, and was one of the lucky few to be able to crawl aboard and balance atop overturned collapsible B or be rescued by a lifeboat. Both Marshall and the owner have separately been able to barely make out the word struck icy in normal daylight wavelengths. And we are confident that this is what is written, in addition to the other markings which are more evident. Hoping to expose the faint pencil writing better, the cork panel was also examined under ultraviolet UV light, which was of no help. The owner intends on pursuing further forensic exams under other light sources such as infrared in the hope that the inscriptions can be further enhanced. Lifebelt from the Martha's Vineyard Museum in September 2022. I was forwarded a photograph by Karen Commuta, who recently found it in her late husband's belongings. It showed a Titanic lifebelt. She mentioned that there was a pencil inscription on the back of the picture. It read photograph of lifebelt from Titanic Museum of Martha's Vineyard. This photo was taken during the 60s or 70s. It was on display in a local museum, a building on the steamship landing in the town of Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts, on the island of Martha's Vineyard. With not much to go on, I did some background research and came across an inventory made on October 15, 2003, for relocation of the Martha's Vineyard Museum's collection to the Martha's Vineyard Historical Society where, among other things, the Titanic lifebelt could be stored more appropriately. The inventory consisted of several appendices, and in them I found the mention of not one, but two Titanic lifebelts. In Appendix D, Inventory of Seamen's Bethel Collection, I found the following: 189, Case 4, Bottom Shelf, Lifebelt from SS Titanic. This was also noted in Appendix F, Previous Inventory of Seamen's Bethel Collection. In that same appendix there was another note: None, Lifebelt from SS Titanic. Does this mean that prior to 1996 there was another lifebelt? We do not know, but we didn't find it in Appendix G Inventory Discrepancies. On October 23, 2003, an article in the Vineyard Gazette wrote of concerns about breaking up the Bethel collection. But it also mentioned that the Titanic life jacket, which has been on the Vineyard for many years, was removed and taken, because records show that the life jacket never had any historical connection with the Vineyard. The article did not say where the lifebelt was taken, but some time ago one of our contacts came across a photograph of the lifebelt on social media. There the description mentioned that the lifebelt formerly in the Martha's Vineyard Museum collection was now transferred to the Boston Marine Society. So we contacted this society, and we heard that the board members of the society did not believe the lifebelt came from Titanic. This was because the lifebelt came with a piece of a Board of Trade document which mentioned the name of John Forrestal. Although a piece of paper that was written in old ink and pinned to the lifebelt prior to the 70s mentioned it was a lifebelt from Titanic, this was not enough evidence to convince the board members to say this was a lifebelt from Titanic. Sadly, the name of John Forrestal could not be linked to Titanic, as he was not a crew member, passenger of Titanic, or crew member of the Carpathia. Perhaps he was a crew member of one of the recovery ships. We don't know yet. Research into the lifebelt still continues.
Lifebelt in Ken Marshall's collection. Part of Mr. Ken Marshall's collection is this front half of a Fosbury lifebelt. He purchased it in early 1997 from an elderly lady in England. The woman had contacted Ed Commuta of the Titanic Historical Society for authentication. The letter included some photographs of half of a lifebelt with faded purple ink stamps showing it as the front, and at the back Titanic is inked on in bold letters. The photos also showed that the cork blocks had been taken out. At the time, the Francatelli lifebelt with its distinctive purple stamps was still in private ownership, and to common knowledge no Titanic lifebelts had markings with a ship's name on them. Therefore, Mr. Commuta thought the lifebelt could not be authentic and forwarded the letter to Mr. Don Lynch, the official historian for the Society, to get his assessment. Mr. Lynch also felt that the lifebelt could not have come from Titanic and wrote to the lady expressing this, but also told her that he was passing her inquiry to Ken Marshall, who had closely examined several bona fide Titanic lifebelts over the decades. In September 1996, Mr. Marshall wrote to the woman enumerating his concerns and inquiring about provenance. The lady replied that she really didn't know, but that the lifebelt had been in the family for many decades. Eventually thought to perhaps be a replica or prop made for some theater or film production, it was offered for sale to him, as it looked like a decent copy of a Titanic-style lifebelt, if not really from the ship. Mr. Marshall purchased it purely for its curiosity value. Upon personal inspection, it was evident that the object was definitely a Titanic-style lifebelt, and that it was old. The dimensions, linen fabric, and thread count all matched known artifacts, but the unusual purple stamps on it made it, at the time, very much an outlier. There was no proof that it had anything to do with Titanic. With these odd stamps, it could have been some earlier or later model of Fosbury lifebelt and come from any vessel of the period, with someone simply lettering Titanic on it later for fun. Since at the time, both Mr. Marshall and the Titanic Historical Society had only seen examples of plain Titanic lifebelts without stamps on them. Including all known archival photographs and newsreel films, its authenticity was very much in doubt. It wasn't until 2007 that Miss Francatelli's lifebelt came to light, exhibiting the identical purple markings as the one Mr. Marshall had purchased several years before. When he saw photographs of this bona fide Titanic lifebelt with rock-solid provenance displaying the exact same stamps as his, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall together. The large, hand-lettered Titanic must have simply been added later to identify the artifact. As the cork had long ago been removed, Mr. Marshall decided in 2014 to have the missing blocks replaced with new, non-acidic foam blocks, and the pockets restitched along the sides by Emmy Award-winning tailor Radford Polinsky using the original whip-stitch needle holes which were still visible. This half lifebelt, now known to be matching Titanic lifebelts in every aspect, is believed to be authentic and has since been displayed at the Titanic Branson and Pigeon Forge exhibitions and at the Catalina Island Museum. In June of 2023, the foam block inserts were replaced with slightly more accurately sized EVA blocks which better simulates cork, and the appearance of the side whip stitching was improved, this time using a double linen thread. Mr. Stephen Proto, with his comprehensive experience making replica Titanic lifebelts, was the perfect man for the job.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you liked it and that you found it interesting. If you like to know more about these lifebelts that came off Titanic, be sure to visit the website titaniclifebelts.net. Do you have more photographs or information about these lifebelts? You can contact us via the before mentioned website.